taken about 6 weeks to put this event together. It wasn't easy. So everyone who's here has made an effort. So thank you very much for coming. Paul, may I start with you?
Thanks, Bobby. Bobby asked me if I'd just say a few words about the wider economic and environmental context to issues of social cohesion, social fracturing. It's really quite straightforward. Take the economic side first. Looked at in terms of broad history, there have been two eras over the last 60 years. Through from 1950 to 1980, we were broadly in a mixed economy mode outside of the centrally planned countries. From 1980 onwards, we made a transition to more of a neoliberal economic model. Fairly clear cut that. It's interesting that in the first 30 years, global economic growth was actually higher than in the second 30 years. It's actually been rather lower, yet it has continued, and it's changed across countries. What has also happened, though, during the neoliberal economic era, which has perhaps been hastened by the Washington Consensus, which has dictated the destruction of the old parastatals in the global south, what has happened has been less and less equitable sharing of the economic growth. And essentially, over the last 30 years in particular, if you look at the global community as a whole, more and more of the benefits of the economic growth have actually been concentrated about 1/5 of the global population. That is not in the old rich states alone. It's a transnational, very broadly based elite. And when one talks about relative marginalization, we're talking about 4/5 of the world's population. It is not that the poor are getting poorer. It is the divisions are widening. And this seems to be an endemic feature of the neoliberal model. It's not delivering socioeconomic justice. There are two implications of this, very briefly. One is that this is a combined issue of economic and environmental issues that has to be addressed now, not in 20 or 30 years' time. And in fact, this decade, the 2010s, is probably absolutely key to that. The second issue is that it is going to be even more important to work towards society hanging together. Cohesion in the face of these external difficulties is actually going to be more important now than even in the last 20 or 30 years. That, in a sense, makes for an extraordinarily interesting but very challenging time we're facing. I have two grandchildren, Zoe, who is 3, and Ben, who is 6 months. Both of them could actually be alive in the 22nd century. They'd be in their early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. That is a reflection of lifespans. It seems to me that they and others of their generation could have a much more peaceful and enlightened world system, depending very much on what people like us do in the next 10 to 20 years. That is why I think this era is so important, and in one real sense, this kind of conference is absolutely vital. Thank you.
Riveting moment. Everybody knows it. We're watching what protests can do all the way around the world, not just North Africa, but Rome and Greece, and of course, obviously, the sense of tension in New York and London. I think that if there's a statement about the lack of social cohesion today, it is that money is too much of the issue, in a sense that there is too much of it. I'm not talking about public money available for expenditure. I'm talking about the fact that discontentedness has overcome so many people so easily that we, to quote David Lammy, who I'm sure you watched David Lammy's interview, many of you, on Saturday at the end of the public inquiry into the Tottenham riots. And David Lammy said that the materialistic and individualistic culture that we've all ascribed to over such a significant period of time has long last come and ripped out our contentedness. It has made us very anguished and distressed people, and that individualism has become something which has turned on us and made us actually fight one another. So the cohesive society has to rebuild the principles of common relationship.
So, and similarly with the banking and the MPs, there seems to be a double standard. But nothing happens. Poor people are not so much complaining about the rich getting richer. It's the fact that they're breaking the rules and they're getting away with it. It's PPP, whatever. They don't call it crime. You know, when people break in shop windows, they call that crime. But when people, fabricate people's statements to say that they've taken out PPI insurance, everybody, just ignores it. It's like white-collar crime.
The reason why I understand your feeling that things are still not going well is twofold, very quickly. One is that still quite a lot of institutions have people in them who don't get the message. And I'm afraid that in spite of the Scarman inquiry and in spite of, after Stephen Lawrence died, the further inquiries, the Met is not a perfect institution and the other police services are not, and there are still people who sneak through who behave in a way that is racist or is unfair, and we need to be very tough on that. But the reason people sense the injustice is because social media, the media, means we all know about it really quickly. Mark Duggan case, it suddenly became news across London and across the UK and around the world, immediately. So we're all conscious. In the past, we'd never know about an injustice on the other side of the world or other side of the country. But we now co-own that, and it triggers things off. The Menezes case outside the tube station in South London.
But on the other hand, and I say this as an ex-BBC person, an ex-ITV person as well, we do have a very vociferous and nasty media culture that is keen to ratchet up the negativity, so that our confidence in the institutions is further eroded than ever it needs to be. I have found myself far too often defending MPs and peers over the expenses-related issues because people have assumed everybody did it, and everybody was doing it, and everybody was ripping off. And when you then present the facts, even with the presentation of the facts, people are still stuck on the, but I read in the Telegraph, the Mail, the whatever, and out comes the misrepresented, deceitful story. That media culture has caused us to be a desperately cynical and I think quite negative nation. But we're all very conscious that we have been led up a garden path of believing the hype of headlines. And that hype of headlines has not enabled us to be a cohesive society. It's divided us very significantly. And I do think we have to put a bit of a laser lens on that and hope we can have a more creative media culture and a more responsible public institutional life as well.
I'm not really somebody who's, I'm not really a politician or anything. I'm just telling you about my experiences. Grew up in East London, sort of Essex, an area called Barking. We saw the film earlier on about the BNP. The BNP were very strong in Barking until about 2 years ago, until the last election. Very strong, very powerful. But when I grew up in that area, one of my first recollections in the early 70s as a little boy, this is in the post-Enoch Powell period where Enoch Powell made his big speech, the Rivers of Blood speech, so-called. I remember being at school and people saying phrases like, kids at school saying, we're with Enoch, and you're only 8 or 9 years old, and slogans on the walls, less wogs, more jobs, and these things actually happen in this country, and people would say things like, I'm not racist, but, and then they would stream out with a bunch of stuff about, look after your own, we look after our own. But in some ways, it was a racist society in some ways, but in some ways it was a much more innocent time. For example, I was a 7-year-old boy and I played Jesus in a school play, a Muslim boy playing Jesus, not once, but twice. But still there are remnants of the British National Party, and you see them sometimes. You see these people, if you go to, I don't know, estates out in somewhere like Dagenham, you'll knock on the door and somebody will open the door and say, well, it's terrible what's happening to our country right now. It's terrible, isn't it? Because they come over, right, They don't want to mix in or anything, do they? Don't want to mix in or nothing, do they? That's, isn't it right, love? And she's like, yeah. And that's why me and the missus, we're emigrating to Spain. And they say that without any irony at all, because it's great there. We've got all our own pubs and everything.
Being in government as you are, congratulations after all these many decades. The erosion that's taking place, as you obviously mentioned in your part, with regards to the society itself, and the communities are breaking down, and obviously what's been mentioned just now, and Michael's comments, how do you perceive the government to move forward with the time that you have to the next election to at least repair some of the damage?
Just one little thing, and in case you were implying that I was alive at the time we were last and I've been waiting all the time since, just for the record, guys.
No, Gladstone.
I wasn't even thinking, No, it wasn't Gladstone. It was a bit more recent. But anyway, there you go. But it has been a long time, and you're right. It's more valuable at the end of the day being in government than in opposition. When I asked my first question of Mrs. Thatcher as an opposition MP, and when I asked my last question to Mrs. Thatcher before she resigned in her last question time, or her last debate, it was about the fact that the gap between the rich and the poor had widened. And Mrs. Thatcher's answer was, you always want to talk down the people who are doing well. The issue shouldn't be whether the gap has widened, but whether the poor are poorer. And you just would like it, according to your agenda, if the poor were poorer. Of course, that's a complete misrepresentation. But when the chief executive of Marks and Spencer earns more than 600 times more than the person on the lowest wage in Marks and Spencer, we have something fundamentally wrong, and it's clear we don't have social cohesion. The man who appeared on Any Questions last Friday as a senior chief executive earning £900,000 may or may not run his company very well, and he may not do a good job for his 160,000 employees, but his salary should not be set by the other directors sitting around the table in his company. It seems to me we have a fundamental flaw in how in employment and industry and allocation of created wealth we keep the whole team together. You're not in it together on the shop floor of M&S if you have no say in what the chief executive earns. And we've seen a society under the Tories and under Labour, when the gap between the rich and the poor has just got wider and wider and wider. And Paul was right, this is common in some of the poorest countries of the world. Go to Bangladesh. It's equally the case in Bangladesh as it is in this country, or India, or Latin America, or wherever. Last point, Bobby. I don't accept that there is fundamentally a broken society. The Prime Minister has used that phrase. It isn't a phrase I would use. There are broken families, and there are some broken communities. And some of the communities in this country are very broken because they have no employment. Go to some communities in the northeast, large council estates on the edge of towns. The chance of getting work experience or a job there is hugely less than even in a borough like mine in London, where life can be quite difficult. And so the third route for me, I've indicated the first, which is having a housing policy that meets needs. I've indicated the second, which is making sure that we bring down the inequalities of wealth and distribution of wealth. The third for me is to do one other thing, which almost nobody is talking about in these terms. I believe that we ought to have a redistribution of work. I believe we need a redistribution of work around the country and a redistribution of work within organisations. There are lots of people who are paid high salaries, whose families are seeing their family break down because of stress and mental illness. The number of people presenting with mental illness goes up, whilst other people are desperate to work. A few people are hugely overworked. Some people have adequate amount of work. Lots of people have inadequate amount of work. If we're really to have social cohesion, we have to give people a feeling that the work's going to be distributed fairly, not just the wealth. Because work is dignity, or can be. Work is the opportunity of your bit of the social network to be able to prosper. Work is the opportunity for your family to respect you and you to respect them. And it seems to me that we've neglected that. It's about regional policy. It's about not concentrating the economics of Britain in the southeast or in London. It's about spreading the wealth to Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the regions. And it's about making sure we do that really proactively. And I hope that what you'll hear from the government tomorrow is a real understanding that actually we need to change the drift to the prosperous and move it to the places that have been less prosperous. I'm not fundamentally pessimistic about the ability to turn things around, because I think, well, everybody's now got the message. Some of us have different remedies, but at least if we're all engaged in the debate, which is what this does, we can listen to each other, share good ideas, and I hope, as Michael indicated, be much more invigorated by getting on with challenging the system.